had. Joining me now, political historian Rich Rubino. This may not be shocking news to many who had followed her personal health over the last few years. She had battled dementia after her husband passed away in 2009. But this is major news in terms of her impact, her life, her legacy, politically and legally for this country. Let's begin personally with her and her past and what brought her to the high court that will be discussed now and in the days ahead.
Yeah, in terms of what brought her to her, she actually came as a politician in terms of being a member, for example, a generally moderate to conservative member of the Arizona State Senate, for example. Senator Barry Goldwater, the senator from Arizona, the 1964 Republican presidential nominee, became kind of her mentor and was somebody who really encouraged her or encouraged her nomination when Ronald Reagan nominated her for the Supreme Court in 1981. And essentially, in terms of legacy, she was basically what Joe Manchin is in the United States Senate. She was the quintessential swing vote. And you have 9 justices on the Supreme Court, so you have an odd number, so she'd always be kind of the 5th justice. But that's basically, I think, what her kind of legacy is. And because of that, and because there's only 9 justices on the Supreme Court, she's left a lasting legacy on everything from affirmative action to reproductive rights to McCain-Feingold campaign finance reform to detainees, for example, in Iraq.
And talk about some of the more consequential votes that she had, the decisive decisions she was part of with the swing and her moderate approach on the high court.
Yeah, I think categorically the most important one was probably Bush v. Gore in 2000. That was the one that essentially stopped the Florida Supreme Court ruling, and George W. Bush became president. She was somebody who voted for that. That was a 5-4 decision. Again, that was very important. I think Planned Parenthood v. Casey in 1992, which reaffirmed abortion rights from Roe v. Wade, and also talked about the idea of an undue burden. That was one of the quintessential cases, and she was also very important in McCain-Feingold. If you remember, McCain-Feingold passed in 1992 and put certain restrictions on campaign financing. She was somebody who supported that as well. And I think this is what's interesting, because when a president nominates a Supreme Court justice, you think that that Supreme Court justice is going to essentially parrot the ideology of a president. And Sandra Day O'Connor, in many respects, did not parrot the ideology of Ronald Reagan. And even back in 1980, Ronald Reagan made the promise. He said, I'm going to nominate a female for the Supreme Court. And in 1981, it was Sandra Day O'Connor. And there were some in the conservative movement who had questions about Sandra Day O'Connor's bona fides with the Republican Party. And you had folks like Barry Goldwater who really had to defend her. And he got appointed to the Supreme Court, and she got appointed, and she really was an independent agent. She really was not somebody like you see the Supreme Court justices in many ways contemporaneously. She was not somebody who kind of just listened to the conservative movement and voted a certain way. She was somebody who was very much independent-minded in that respect.
She was also considered the most powerful woman in America when she served, particularly early on. How did she consider and impart her role as a woman on the high court so early?
Yeah, and that was, well, of course, Ronald Reagan had made that promise. And interestingly, folks like Jerry Falwell and many on the Christian conservatives, the moral majority, were ardently opposed to the idea that she would be on the Supreme Court because of her past views on abortion. But she actually came in and she actually did very much become a mentor. And after she left, she was very much, for example, involved in civics education. But I think if you thought of maybe the 10 most influential women in the last 40 years in the United States, you'd probably have 2 of them on the Supreme Court. No matter what you think of them ideologically, but you certainly have Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the left and Sandra Day O'Connor kind of on the center right in many respects, and they died within just less than about a year from each other. But if you look at it in terms of the Supreme Court, if you think of all the justices you remember, there are over 200. There are very few you're going to remember. There's Thurgood Marshall, for example, the first African-American, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, certainly Earl Warren, who had the very influential Warren Court, John Marshall, the third Supreme Court Justice of the United States, who signed the legendary decision of Marbury versus Madison. I think Sandra Day O'Connor is very much in that. She's in that conversation. Is probably one of the 10 most influential United States Supreme Court justices, in part because she's a woman, but I think more importantly because she was the swing vote in so many instrumental cases.
How involved did she stay, Rich, in the years after she retired?
Yeah, she was involved, not so much in terms of policy, but more so, and she was a little involved in that, but I think it was civics education was kind of her bailiwick. That was something that was very important to her. She didn't like the way that it was taught. She thought that there should be more, that Americans should learn more towards civics education. That was kind of really her main focus, but she also, of course, had family issues. She had a husband, for example, who was very ill toward the end of his life. So she had other things that she had to deal with as well. But that's probably her. But her legacy, I think, for the most part, is what she actually did on the United States Supreme Court, not what she did before when she was a politician and not what she did afterward when she retired.
What do we know about her personal life, though? We talked about the loss of her husband and some of her later health struggles that led to her death today. But they have 3 children, how they met, and her upbringing.
Yeah, we don't know that much about her personal life in terms of what it's been like the past couple of years. We do know it's very similar in many respects. You have Rosalind Carter, who died just a couple of days ago. Very similar circumstances. Stayed with essentially the same man with somebody. And it's interesting because lots of times Supreme Court justices come from the judiciary, right? Whether it was with someone like Samuel Alito, sometimes they come from academia and the judiciary. She was someone who actually came from a political background. And the reason that's so fascinating is because when you come from a political background and then you become a Supreme Court justice, you already have a record. So when you're being confirmed, for example, people will look and they'll say, how did you vote on this? How did you vote on this from the United States Senate? But she really, I think, tried to be somewhat of an arbiter of justice. And I think that that is some way she had to kind of separate herself, almost like go into a different prism and really try to advocate for simply jurisprudence as opposed to what she did before, which was essentially being an advocate for her constituents and also to a certain degree being actually an advocate for the Republican Party and the moderate to conservative position in the Arizona state legislature.
Rich, people often think that the court is reflective of the times. It has certainly evolved over the years. How is it different from when Sandra Day O'Connor served starting in the early 80s to what we're seeing now and some of the criticism of the court, particularly on Capitol Hill, even this week over ethics?
Yeah, they're still actually very cordial. As soon as you walk in, they all actually shake their hands. They have certain traditions. For example, the person who was appointed, who became a Supreme Court justice the last time is the one who, for example, has to open the door and that type of thing. So you still have a lot of that, and they still actually get along pretty well. You had scenarios where of all people, Sandra Sotomayor actually praised Clarence Thomas, for example. But ideologically, this Supreme Court is almost is pretty much right down partisan lines. You have 4 justices. You have the conservative justices, and then you have liberal justices. And with folks like John Paul Stevens no longer on the court, or Sandra Day O'Connor, who is very much the moderate voice, you now have a scenario where Elena Kagan, where Sandra Sotomayor, and where the liberal wing of the party is going to vote a certain way, and then the conservative wing is going to vote another way. As I say, unlike the United States Congress, where you don't have a scenario where, for example, AOC and Marjorie Taylor Greene are palling around afterward, in this scenario, is actually very civil. But if you can somehow bifurcate the ideology versus the relationship they have with each other, ideologically, this is a very divided court. George W. Bush and Donald Trump appointed the Republican justices. The Democratic justices, of course, were appointed by Joe Biden and Barack Obama, respectively. And in some cases, they were appointed because of certain constituencies in the Democratic Republican parties that we absolutely need this person on there. When Sandra Day O'Connor, and for that matter, John Paul Stevens, or even Anthony Kennedy, who was a Gerald Ford appointee, were on the Supreme Court, you did not know what they were going to vote. Today, you know what the Supreme Court justice is going to vote about 95% of the time, probably before the case is even heard. Back then, there were really quintessential swing votes, and that is the legacy of Sandra Day O'Connor more than just about anything else.
Right, and it's just another indication of the shift that we have all witnessed in our lifetimes as we look back and remember her life and legacy and some of these notable decisions with those swing votes as you talk about. Rich Rubino, thank you for your historical perspective of her passing and her work. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on.
We'll be right back.